You're listening to Villains and Virgins podcast. And in our last episode, we talked about Julius Caesar invading the island of Britain twice, with few lasting results. In that episode, we also talked a lot about the Celts, their culture and traditions, and the origins of a lot of modern holidays that are still connected to that ancient set of traditions. So if you didn't catch that episode, you may want to go back and catch up before I continue our story. Now, as we pick up the thread today, I should clarify one or two things. When I say Britain, we're talking about ancient Britain, not the modern nation state that you're familiar with. So I'm talking about the entire island of Britain, which includes the territories that are now known as Scotland, Ireland, England, and Wales. So that's the entire landmass, is what I mean when I say Britain. I'm also going to refer to the inhabitants of Britain, or the people who live all over that landmass, as Britons, British tribes, or Celts. Because, of course, they were Celts at that time. And when I'm talking about Celts in this episode, I'm referring to the ones that lived there. Although, of course, there were other Celtic peoples quite nearby, in the Roman province of Gaul, for example, which is now known as France. So we'll be focusing on the island of Britain and the people who lived there. Now, when Julius Caesar invaded Britain for the second time in 54 BC, he did achieve a battlefield victory. He certainly did better than his first attempt, where there were a number of battles that culminated in Caesar and his men bravely running away in their boats. But he returns a second time in 54, and he achieves a battlefield victory, which is kind of amazing because he only had 25,000 men, and he was facing a coalition of a whole bunch of tribes that lived in Britain that had united to face his invading force. And they united under the leadership of one tribe in particular, who were known as the Catuvellauni, and they're going to be really important in our story today. The Celts really should have won this battle, but the reason they didn't had a lot to do with infighting amongst the tribes. You see, the coalition very quickly collapsed as some tribes tried to get an advantage over others and were willing to sell information to the Romans in order to do that. So the settlement of the Catuvellauni themselves and their king was actually betrayed to the Romans by another British tribe. And it was that event that allowed Julius Caesar to lead his legions right over there and achieve a battlefield victory, which ended with the surrender of the British tribes and terms of tribute. So as a condition of surrender, the British tribes had to agree to pay tribute to Rome every year, a certain sum of money. And then Julius Caesar takes his men and leaves after a mere 10 weeks in country, which is an astonishing thing to think about. So he's achieved this enormous profile-raising exercise because there's no doubt that the successful invasion of Britain and the securing of an agreement to pay tribute did wonders for Julius Caesar the man and very much contributed to launching the rest of his political career, which culminated in him being virtually a dictator for life. Now, the Britons reneged on their agreement to pay tribute to Rome almost immediately. And Caesar didn't leave an occupying force on the island because he needed his legions to go continue fighting several more years of hard battles in neighboring Gaul, which we now call France. For all intents and purposes, life in Britain continued very much as it had before the Roman invasion, with one interesting difference: that the Britons and the Romans were far more aware of each other than they had been before. The Britons had now had first-hand experience of the tactical effectiveness of Roman legions, as well as the amount of wealth and power that the Roman Empire could exercise. Furthermore, the flood of Roman products only intensified because next door in France, which was then the Roman province of Gaul, there was a very established Roman occupation, and there was a steady stream of Mediterranean goods that were going into Gaul and therefore could also travel into Britain via the already well-established trade routes that were in operation between Britain and the mainland of France, or Gaul. So we see a lot of products like drinking amphora, olives, Mediterranean wine, and so on that are being transported from Gaul into Britain. And this is having an effect because it's a continuous reminder of the wealth and the power of the Roman Empire, which has a very solid foothold right across the English Channel. Some Gaulish tribes were friends of Rome, and this is a fact that wouldn't have been lost on some of the British tribes across the Channel, who were beginning to eye the benefits of having such a powerful ally as Rome, with the wealth and support it could potentially offer in competitions that tribe might have against other closer tribes nearby. However, there was one tribe, the Catuvellauni, which had historically been leading the British resistance to every single Roman invasion so far, and they remain very powerful in the island of Britain, very influential. In fact, the chieftain of the Catuvellauni tribe, a man named Canobilinus, is actually referred to by the Romans at the time as the King of Britain, which is a reflection of their perception of how powerful and influential he was in brokering alliances and in getting tribes to work together under his leadership from time to time. Now, it was during the rule of this particular chieftain in the year 30 CE that a young girl is born by the name of Boudica. And we're going to be hearing a lot more about her as our story goes on. But she's born in the capital city of the Catuvellauni tribe, a place called Camulodunum. The events that are about to unfold happen during Boudicca's lifetime, and they're going to shape her identity and the future of the entire island of Britain. So we're going to view these things through her eyes, as anyone who was alive at the time would have experienced them. Now, Boudicca would have been about 10 years old in the year 40 CE. So to put this in perspective, this is about 95 years after Julius Caesar has come and gone. So nearly a century of Britain being left more or less to itself. And Canobilinus, the chieftain of the Catuvellauni tribe, exercising an enormous amount of influence in the area. But it's during this year that the chieftain Canobilinus exiles one of his sons, a guy called Adminius. So kicks him out. He's not allowed to live on tribal land anymore. He's certainly not going to succeed to be chieftain himself. I'm not sure what crime Adminius committed, but it must have been very serious. And Adminius flees far, far away. In fact, he goes all the way to Rome. And when he's there, he's busy talking to the current emperor of Rome, a guy you might recognize by the name of Caligula, and trying to persuade the Roman emperor that invading Britain again would be a great idea. Why does Adminius want to bring Roman legions into Britain? I mean, it's a terrible act of treachery on his part, and the only explanation that seems plausible is that Adminius had set up some kind of deal whereby he would be placed in charge with the power of Roman legions behind him, but perhaps he was hoping to rule as some sort of client king. So he was going to take over rule in Britain if he was going to be arriving with Roman legions at his back. That may have been his plan. And there's some evidence that Caligula was very interested in this and actually began to make some preparations to do it. But unfortunately, before any troops left Rome for Britain, Caligula died. Project Let's Invade Britain Again only got moving about 3 years later under the next Roman emperor, Claudius. And this time, Rome sends a much larger force. They're not interested in a profile elevation exercise. This time, they plan to establish a more permanent occupation. So, by contrast, when Caesar invaded Britain, he brought 25,000 men the second time. When Emperor Claudius goes in, at this point in the year 43 CE, he brings 40,000 men. So you have to imagine a flotilla of ships, just a dark cloud of Roman ships on the horizon coming across the water from the English Channel, from modern-day France or Gaul. And they would have set sail heading to Britain in far greater numbers than the British tribes had ever seen before. And at this point, young Boudica, who's living right there in the heart of Catuvellauni territory, is only 13 years old, and her world is about to change forever. Now, at this point in time, right before the Roman invasion, there are 3 British tribes that already have established friendly relations with Rome. And those tribes are the Iceni, the Regni, and the Brigantes. And that last tribe, the Brigantes, are the largest of the 3, a very powerful tribe whose territory falls where modern Yorkshire lies. And they were actually ruled by a queen, a woman named Cartimandua. This, by the way, was something the Romans found shocking. The idea that a woman could wield political power and the rule of a tribe in her own right, not as the wife of somebody else, as sort of a secondary ruler, but a primary ruler. But this is exactly what Cartimandua was. In fact, there were quite a number of features of Celtic women and their role in their societies that astonished Roman sources. For example, one Roman account describes Celtic women as very tall and good-looking, and also fully the equal of their men in fighting when they got angry. Now, I don't know if this particular Roman had actually witnessed Celtic women fighting, but we do know that they did train with weapons, that it wasn't uncommon for them to be able to use them. But this idea was completely foreign to Romans. In addition to that, Celtic women enjoyed a much larger degree of sexual freedom. Again, we have Roman sources commenting with some degree of shock on the fact that young Celtic women were not bound by any sort of expectation of virginity before marriage, and that they freely bestowed their affections on whatever man they chose, and it was they perceived it as an insult to be refused by someone that they approached. So this sort of sexual autonomy was unknown to Romans and something they couldn't help remarking on. I mean, the Romans, by contrast, had far stricter rules for female behavior. Roman women couldn't even attend public sporting matches in many cases. Their lives were very highly regulated by their fathers and husbands, and they were expected primarily to stay at home and to tend the house and the children. They weren't supposed to be involved in public life, in politics, and God forbid, in any kind of fighting. That was considered completely improper in Roman society. And while there are examples of women who broke these rules, they were usually slaves or prostitutes. Respectable Roman women were chaste and stayed at home. So the experience of observing Celtic women who were not at all constrained by these domestic expectations or these sexual behavior standards was an eye-opener for a lot of Romans. So we have these 3 friendly tribes in Britain who already have some kind of alliance with Rome, and perhaps they've made this agreement ahead of a possible invasion, hoping that they're going to be able to retain some degree of autonomy, some degree of control over their own territory under the auspices of Roman permission or rule. But these are the only 3 that are friendly that we know about. The rest of the tribes in Britain are massing together to resist this invasion, once again under the leadership of the Catuvellauni tribe, Boudicca's tribe. So Boudica is part of an upper-class family in the Catuvellauni tribe. We don't know how many brothers and sisters she had, but her father and brothers would very likely have been warriors, because the aristocrats in Celtic societies were warriors. That was their job. That's how they distinguished themselves. And so members of her family would, without a doubt, have been very much involved in the military organization to repel this invasion force. The Celtic armies are massing together under the leadership of the Catuvellauni, which at this point is shared by 2 men. They're the sons of Canobilinus, we've already mentioned, who is a powerful chieftain. He's dead at this point. So these are his 2 sons, Tagadumnus and Caratacus, and they have joint rulership of the Catuvellauni, and under their leadership, many of the other tribes of Britain are now united to face the Roman threat. There are a number of battles, but the Roman legions end up defeating this Celtic army, and Tagadumnus dies. So one of these 2 chieftains is eliminated. Caratacus, the other one, manages to escape alive, but it's a crushing defeat. And as a result, many of the tribes begin to make their own terms with the Romans. The big battle is over, and the Romans are here to stay. A few months later, Emperor Claudius himself visits Britain with war elephants and an impressive procession, during which he accepts the formal surrender of many of the chieftains of British tribes. It's an official recognition of the Roman victory. Emperor Claudius stays in Britain for 16 days and then returns to Rome to have the traditional victory parade. And so this is an enormous celebration for Rome. They've conquered and are now occupying the distant and exotic land of the barbarian Britons. It's a very significant expansion of the Roman Empire and sort of a jewel in the crown, if you will. The occupying Roman forces that are now remaining in Britain build their first permanent settlement right on the territory of the Catuvolani tribe, the tribe that has been so significant in every single British resistance against Roman invasion. And so they go straight to the capital, Camulodunum, of that tribe. They level it and they build the Roman colony of Colchester. So Camulodunum wasn't just the capital of the Catuvolani, it was Boudicca's hometown. It was where she was from. It was the seat of that tribe and its traditions. So this would have been devastating for her and for all the members of her tribe. Despite battlefield defeat, not all Britons are ready to accept Roman occupation and submit to Roman rule. So you remember Caratacus, one of the two Catuvolani chieftains. He escapes from the battlefield in the year the Romans invade in 43 and immediately begins a guerrilla warfare campaign, which lasts for 8 years. So this man and his family are crisscrossing the island of Britain, and wherever they go, they are galvanizing other tribes to rise up and to attack Roman forces when they least expect it. These are hit and run raids. They are parties of armed warriors that will get in, slaughter Romans as they're on the roads, doing some building project or moving from one place or another, and then they'll disappear into the trees. So they continue this campaign for 8 long years, and Caratacus becomes this sort of Robin Hood figure. He's a folk hero because he symbolizes the resistance of the Celtic people to the yoke of Roman occupation. And while the Romans are officially in charge and they are trying to implement Roman law and Roman roads and Roman customs, you have this man who becomes a symbol of the British spirit that is yet not quite broken as long as he's out there and doing the things that he's doing. And we can only imagine that, Celts would have traded stories of this man, that in their own tribal territories where they were occupied by Roman troops and they had to watch Roman legions marching by and pay taxes, they'd be sitting around their fires at night whispering about where Caratacus might be next, or passing stories about who had seen him last, or who might be sheltering him, or sending him aid. It's a long time, 8 years, for this man to be on the run and popping up from very geographically distant areas and mobilizing very, very different troops from the north to the west and the east and the south. He's highly mobile, and he has to be to stay alive. But in the year 51 CE, after 8 years of this guerrilla warfare, Caratacus and his current band of warriors suffer a crushing military defeat at the hands of a Roman by the name of Asturius Scapula, no relationship to your shoulder bone. So in the wake of this battle, in which a large number of Celts must have died, Caratacus and his family are forced to run for their lives. And at this point, with very few options left, they choose to seek shelter with the Brigantes tribe, which is ruled, as you may recall, by Queen Cartimandua. I mentioned before that the Brigantes tribe was one of the 3 friendly tribes that had an agreement with Rome before the legions actually landed in 43. It's worth digressing for a minute to talk about Queen Cartimandua, their ruler, because she's a fascinating figure in her own right. So she's inherited the rule of this tribe from her grandfather. It's passed directly to her. It's not as though, it passed to her husband and he died and she was left holding the reins. She was selected for succession, and she holds that reign in her own authority. She marries a man named Vinicius, a warrior from the same tribe, and rules with him for many years. And then she decides to have an affair with Venutius's shield bearer. So I need to explain this because to understand what a shield bearer is, we have to talk a little bit about how Celtic warriors fought. So members of the warrior aristocracy in Britain were famous for their use of war chariots. The Romans didn't use war chariots, but they commented on the fact that the Celts did, and thousands of these chariots might be mobilized in a large battle. The war chariot was operated by a tight-knit unit of 3 men. There was the warrior himself, who owned the chariot and the horses, and then he had his 2 men. One of them was the chariot driver. So he was in charge of maneuvering that chariot and its horses in and around obstacles and battle and fighting and all this sort of thing. And the other was the shield bearer, whose responsibility was obviously to hold the shield and to block. And the shield bearer and chariot driver had to get the warrior to where he needed to go, line him up so he could throw his javelin, and then when that was done, wheel him into the battle where he wanted to be. The warrior would dismount, he would fight, and that chariot could pick him up and move him around as necessary. So that warrior relied on these 2 men, the chariot driver and the shield bearer, for his survival. And they trained and fought as a very small, very close-knit unit. So you have to understand just what an insult it would be for Cartimandua to decide to carry on with her husband's shield bearer. First of all, this man was her husband's social inferior. Secondly, she wasn't just rejecting her husband in a very public way, she was also destroying his closest fighting unit. Because you can hardly imagine Venutius and his shield bearer being able to operate as any kind of a functional unit when this was going on. So Cartimandua actually divorces her husband in favor of this shield bearer, and this causes a scandal. You can imagine then that things have already been quite colorful in the ruling house of the Brigantes tribe when Caradoc and his family arrive on their doorstep seeking shelter. So this is a problem for Cartimandua, because remember, she's officially an ally of Rome and has been for some time. So Caradoc and his family are fugitives from Rome, and they're not just any fugitives, they are the chief agitators and the thorn in the side of the Roman occupation. But Caradoc is also wildly popular amongst Britons across the entire island. So Cartimandua has a dilemma on her hands. Is she going to shelter this man and thereby put her own rule and the future of her tribe at risk? Or is she going to hand him over, thereby keeping her agreement with the Romans and making herself an even more trustworthy ally? Cartimandua opts for option B. She puts Caradoc and his family in chains and then sends a message to the Romans that they can come and pick him up, which they do. This is an enormously unpopular move. I mean, Caradoc is a folk hero. He's got this enormous significance for people across the entire island of Britain. But also, turning someone over to the Romans meant the certainty of humiliation, possibly torture, and certainly death. So this is what Caradoc and his family can now expect as a result of Cartimandua's choice. And it's incredibly unpopular amongst not just her tribe, but most other people who hear about it. Captured chieftains and their families were usually paraded down the streets of Rome as part of a ritual victory celebration before being ritually murdered in front of a crowd. That was what normally happened. And so this is the fate that Britons foresaw for Caradoc and his family. Strangely, though, this isn't how the story ended for Caradoc and his family. It's a shocking twist of fate, but they are taken to Rome, they are brought before Emperor Claudius, and apparently Caradoc makes such a stirring and moving speech that Emperor Claudius himself pardons the man. He's not executed, and he and his family are allowed to live in exile in Italy for the rest of their lives. So they don't actually suffer the fate that befell pretty much everyone else in his position. But that was a lucky bonus for Caradoc, to which his reputation and perhaps his eloquence is what we can attribute that to. It's certainly not something that anyone else could have foreseen. In exchange for handing over this very valuable rebel, Queen Cartimandua was generously rewarded by Rome, but she paid a terrible cost. Very, very quickly, she was facing an uprising from her own people, led by none other than her ex-husband Venutius, who, you could imagine, had some scores of his own to settle as well. So she's very soon on the run, having lost her position as a result of the decision that she made. Leaving the Brigantes tribe and Cartimandua aside now, things hadn't been going so smoothly for the other tribes that were officially friendly to Rome either. One of those three were the Iceni, and within 5 years of the Roman invasion in 43, they are also having their own uprising against Roman rule. It's perhaps not a coincidence that it's this very same year, 47 to 48 CE, that Boudica marries into that tribe. Remember, Boudicca's tribe, the Catuvellauni, have been fiercely against the Romans from the beginning. The Iceni have had a very different posture for some years now, but now the Iceni are fighting the Romans. So perhaps this is the reason that Boudicca's family approved her marrying into that tribe. Perhaps it seemed that the Iceni were now finally on the right side of things, fighting the Romans. We can only speculate. In any case, Boudicca is 18 years old when she marries into this tribe at the moment that they're involved in an uprising, and then the Romans crush it. And once again, we see occupying Romans now building a garrison right there on the territory of this Iceni tribe that Boudicca is now a part of. It's at about this same time, the year 48 and then the following year, 49 CE, that the Romans are busy expanding and strengthening their colony of Colchester back in Boudicca's hometown, what used to be Camulodunum in Catuvellauni territory. While there were many garrisons and towns and forts, Colchester was the first official Roman colony in Britain, and that's a concept that we should stop and explain for just a moment. You see, a colony was supposed to be a permanent settlement where the families of ex-legionaries, of Roman soldiers, were given land so they could permanently settle and have homes and property. Roman legionaries were often paid with land as part of their wages. They were promised for their service that they would be given land that would be their own. So this colony was a way of paying legionaries with land. Of course, the land had to be taken from other people to give to Roman soldiers and their families. So this land was being taken from members of the Catuvellauni tribe and awarded to these ex-legionaries. The colony was also supposed to be a model of Roman civilization and life. So there were public buildings that were erected. There were different zones that were established for commercial activities, for legal activities, for residences. The entire space was going to be organized and laid out in a Roman fashion. It was supposed to be a model of Roman civic life for the inhabitants of an occupied territory. They could observe Romans living as Romans did and see the model of life that was going to be exported everywhere else as time and resources permitted. One of the more curious features of the colony at Colchester was the necessary shrine for the worship of the emperor that the Romans set up. Now, emperor worship is something that sounds really strange to modern ears, and it's not quite as religious as it sounds. It was in many ways an exercise of political power. So it's something that was actually established by Julius Caesar's successor, his nephew, who became known as Caesar Augustus. And he was the first official emperor. Julius Caesar just got dictator for life, and then he was assassinated for being, bold enough to try and take so much power. But his successor becomes the first true Caesar, the first emperor. And one of the things that he does was have his uncle, Julius Caesar, declared a god after his death. And this is, of course, very convenient because then it allows Caesar Augustus to refer to himself as a descendant of a god. Caesar Augustus refers to himself as descended from the god Julius Caesar, but also the other gods like Apollo. And he even starts to refer to himself as Caesar, son of God, as one of his official titles. So this is where the practice begins to originate as a very definite political device that Caesar Augustus invents. Now, Caesar Augustus was very successful in bringing peace and stability to the Roman Empire after years of civil war, which had taken an enormous cost in life and wealth from families across the empire. So his rule was met with a large degree of relief. And there was a rumor that in certain parts of Asia Minor, in part of the Roman Empire there, shrines were set up where grateful residents of the Roman Empire spontaneously expressed their gratitude for the peace and good fortune that had been brought to them under the rule of Caesar Augustus. Now, whether it was true or not that these shrines just spontaneously emerged as a result of the overflow of gratitude, we don't know for sure. Very soon, it was expected that citizens across the empire burn incense ritually in these shrines in the name of the empire. And it was kind of an act of political allegiance. And it didn't mean that you couldn't worship other gods and burn incense to other deities and have other religious practices at all. The Romans were very permissive in that way, but it was sort of, a formal act of lip service, if you will, that was expected, a tip of the hat to the emperor and his genius. But of course, this caused problems throughout the Roman Empire because while there were many polytheists, people who believed in lots of different gods and didn't really mind burning incense to the Roman emperor along with their other temple obligations, it didn't go down well with the monotheists, by which I mean the Jews and the Christians, who begin to emerge right about this time during the reign of Caesar Augustus. So these communities worship only one god, and it wasn't Caesar. And they took great offense to the idea that they would be expected to burn incense to Caesar as though he were a god in a shrine. And they were willing to die, in some cases, as an act of resistance to this policy. So it was very problematic in certain parts of the empire. We can only imagine what the Celts thought of the Romans now building one of these shrines to the emperor and expecting that Celts would come and burn incense to him as an act of reverence or gratitude. We have some clues, though, about what the Celts thought of it. We know that the golden statue of Emperor Claudius that was erected in Colchester was later beheaded and its head found in a bog. So that gives you some indication of public sentiment. The fact was that the Celts already had their own religious practices, and they were very, very strong and had no place for the emperor in them. To make matters worse, while the Romans were building shrines for the worship of their emperor on Celtic territory, they were also busy demolishing existing religious sites that were part of the Celtic religion. And for Celts, in particular, forest groves and springs were regarded as sacred. They were regarded as places where the deities could be contacted, and there were quite a number of deities in the Celtic tradition, both male and female. So forest groves and springs were often designated as holy places where offerings could be made, especially wealth offerings, coins, gold jewelry, metal things were offered to deities by depositing them into springs or bogs. And also in forest groves, where other types of rituals and sacrifices to the gods were made. And we have a description of one of these sacred groves in Britain from a Roman poet by the name of Lucan, who includes this description in a poem that he writes. A grove there was untouched by men's hands from ancient times, whose interlacing boughs enclosed a space of darkness and cold shade, and banished the sunlight from above. Gods were worshipped there with savage rites. The altars were heaped with hideous offerings, and every tree was sprinkled with human gore. On those boughs birds feared to perch. In those coverts wild beasts would not lie down, nor wind ever bore down upon that wood, nor thunderbolt hurled from black clouds. The trees, even when they spread their leaves to no breeze, rustled of themselves. Water also fell there in abundance from dark springs. The images of the gods, grim and rude, were uncouth blocks formed of felled tree trunks. Their mere antiquity and the ghastly hue of the rotten timber struck terror. Legend also told that often the subterranean hollows quaked and bellowed, that yew trees fell down and rose again, that the glare of conflagrations came from trees that were not on fire, and that serpents twined and glided round their stems. The people never resorted thither to worship at close quarters, but left the place to the gods. For when the sun is in mid-heaven, or dark night fills the sky, the priest himself dreads to approach and fears to surprise the Lord of the Grove. You get the sense of this impossibly ancient place. A forest of the kind that you and I have never seen and will never be old enough to see, where the trees are centuries old, beyond human memory, and are so closely laced together that you can't even see the light. And it's in places like this that were so dark and so ancient that Celts thought there were secrets and there were spirits, and that one could get close to the gods. But it was a terrifying experience. One of the ways that the Celts propitiated their deities was with human sacrifice, which, as Lucan indicates, happened in places like this. That human gore that's smeared on the trees is not an act of his imagination. This happened. It wasn't just that people were sacrificed as offerings to the gods. They were also killed ritually to try and foretell the future, because there was a Celtic tradition of trying to divine the future through the way that somebody who was ritually killed would spurt blood and the pattern that they would fall to the ground with. So these practices were ongoing, and they happened in places like this, which could only have added to the terror that any observer there would experience, whether they were a Celt or a Roman. Now, if this wood and these trees sound a lot like the weirwood from Game of Thrones, that's probably not a coincidence. It's very likely that George Martin took some inspiration for his story from these actual historical practices that we have records for. Now, we know that Julius Caesar deliberately cut down a sacred grove when he arrived in Britain nearly 90 years before. And when the Romans invade for keeps under Claudius, they build a road right through a religious sanctuary that's centered on a water spring. So they're deliberately destroying and placing their own structures on top of these holy places that exist in the Celtic tradition. Now, how the locals felt about watching land that used to be theirs seized by the Romans to build colonies and temples to the emperor on isn't much discussed in Roman records, but we can imagine that there was a fair amount of resentment. Also due to the fact that many Celts were forced to serve as forced labor for the creation of these edifices. So it's not just your land that's being stolen, but you're going to work to build the edifices of the conqueror on that land. It certainly wasn't a popular policy, and we're going to see the outcome of that very soon, but I don't want to get ahead of myself in our story. In 54 CE, 11 years after the Romans invade Britain to stay, Emperor Claudius decides to ban the Druids. Now, if you listen to episode 1, you'll have heard an awful lot about the Druids, and you'll know that they had an enormous role in Celtic life. They were, of course, the officials of religious practice, like priests. So they were the ones doing the sacrifices, the telling of the future, organizing religious festivals, and so on. But their role wasn't only religious. They also served as judges, as arbiters, and as scholars. They embodied the oral traditions of Celtic culture. There were many years of training involved in becoming a druid, and a lot of that training had to do with memorization of the lore of Celtic tradition and history. So they were incredibly important figures. And when the Romans banned them, they did so ostensibly because they were outraged by these human sacrifice practices that the Druids engaged in. But it's far more persuasive to see this as a Roman move to get rid of the Druids because they were such powerful agents of rebellion and resistance. The Druids could travel between tribes. They had a high degree of personal authority, and so they could carry messages between different tribes and possibly unite them against Roman rule. So they were dangerous. And because they were seen as dangerous, the emperor decides to ban them, and this means that his troops can then go about attacking and demolishing Druid centers and killing individual Druids themselves. This official position of the Roman occupiers toward the Druids is going to play an important role in the events that are about to unfold. So just keep in mind that they initiate this policy a decade after invading, and they're going to ratchet up the pressure on this in the next couple of years, which is going to create all sorts of other problems. Meanwhile, they're not just destroying sacred groves and going after Druids and building fortified camps. The Romans are also building roads. They're building roads all over Britain. And you can still see some of these roads today. It's astonishing because they're nearly 2,000 years old. But the footprint of this Roman occupation of Britain remains in some places visible to this day. And these roads, of course, made it a lot easier to move legions across the territory, but they also benefited merchants and even Celts themselves, who were able to travel across territory more directly than they had been able to before. Roman settlements also featured public buildings, public toilets, and public baths. And this last thing was completely new to Britain. It hadn't been seen before. The idea that there was an official building where people could go and bathe that wasn't privately owned. It didn't exist. But you can still see these installations today. The town of Bath in the UK is called the town of Bath because the Romans built a public bath installation there, which has been marvelously preserved. I've been there. I've seen it. And if you ever get the chance to go, you definitely should. But this is one of these innovations that the Romans bring, which is completely new to the island. The Roman occupation itself was divided amongst a number of important figures. There was the Roman legate, who was sort of the emperor's representative, and he was often a patrician, an upper-class Roman. His role was to preside over military and civilian affairs, and especially to make and enforce the laws that would regulate life in an occupied territory. Then there was the provincial governor, and he was in charge of most of the daily details of administration. He did the bulk of the work of keeping the occupation system running. The provincial governor in Britain at the time of this story is a man named Gaius Suetonius, who you're going to hear a whole lot about very soon. Finally, there's the procurator, and he's the tax collector. A very important guy because the occupation runs on taxes that have to be collected from unwilling citizens of that occupation. So the procurator has to actually get his hands on the money that Rome says it is owed from reluctant British tribes. This taxation led to a host of other problems. The idea of paying tribute was unpopular, but many Britons would have put up with it. The problem was that there were a number of abuses that were soon developed in the course of collecting these taxes. Things like telling Britons that they had to pay taxes in grain, but then the Romans collecting all the grain in one spot themselves and forcing Britons to travel miles across the land to buy the amount of grain that they owed the Romans and then pay it back to the Romans. So the grain never actually left the Roman granary. But Britons had to travel long distances, the time that they were away from their homes and their fields, for this ridiculous exercise of paying for grain that they never actually brought or put their hands on and didn't actually leave the granary. So this kind of unnecessary red tape, if you like, led to a lot of resentment, as well as, of course, individual tax collectors adding their own bonuses, taxing sales, taxing property, and so on. The Romans even introduced a poll tax so that Britons had to pay for the garrison of Roman troops on their own land, ostensibly to protect them from what the Britons might reasonably have asked. So there was a whole different range of these fees and taxes that were building up. So to put all this in perspective, think of how life has changed for the average Celt in Britain. The Romans arrive, they take your land, they build their own things on that land, and they force you to carry the stones and actually work the hours that it's going to be required to build baths and shrines for the worship of the Roman ruler. Meanwhile, they're destroying the places where you do your religious practices, and they're even murdering the Druids, who are some of the most important members of your society. So the picture ends up being increasingly dark, increasingly an angry situation, and one that a lot of Celts deeply resent. And at this point in our story, the Romans have been occupying Britain for a decade. And Boudica was 13 when they arrived. So she's seen her hometown destroyed and a Roman colony built on it. She's seen Caratacus, the chieftain of her tribe who had escaped alive, lead a guerrilla battle for 8 years before being betrayed by another Celt, Queen Cartimandua, and being led off to Rome in chains. And for all most Britons knew, he was dead. And now she's married into another tribe which had its own rebellion that was again brutally suppressed, and the Romans have built another armed installation in that territory to make sure that nobody has any ideas of doing something similar again. So there's this crushing weight of the Roman boot everywhere you look. And the landscape and the way people live has altered almost unimaginably. Boudicca married a man named Prasutagus when she was only 18, and he was a member of this Iceni tribe, definitely upper class. He becomes king of the Iceni. We assume that he became king right after the Iceni rebellion in 47 or 48, because if he'd been part of that rebellion in any visible way, the Romans would certainly have removed him and prevented him from exercising any authority. So when he takes over as king of the Iceni, right after that rebellion, Boudicca becomes queen of that tribe. And the two of them have 2 children, 2 daughters, in fact. We actually have a physical description of Boudicca from Roman sources at the time. And this is what they say. Boudicca was, quote, very tall, the glance of her eye most fierce, her voice harsh. A great mass of the reddest hair fell to her hips. Her appearance was terrifying. Now this, remember, was written by a Roman source, which might explain why she's perceived as terrifying, because she definitely comes across as having an imposing physical presence that would not have been something that Roman women would typically have exercised. Boudicca's husband, King Prasutagus, is walking a very delicate line. He's trying to be friends with the Romans and avoid being swallowed by them or utterly taken over by the Roman occupation in the ways that other tribes have experienced. The Iceni, remember, have been sort of allies with Rome on and off for a while, and they've had a greater degree of autonomy as a result. Prasutagus has a problem, though. Both of his children are female. This wouldn't be a problem amongst British tribes. We've seen British women take over and inherit the leadership of tribes. Queen Cartimandua did it. There were other very strong Celtic women who acted as leaders. The problem is that Britain is now occupied by Rome, and Rome does not recognize female succession or inheritance of property. So Prasutagus worries that if he leaves the rule of his tribe to his daughters, the Romans just aren't going to recognize it. So he comes up with what seems to be an ingenious solution. He writes a will in which he names his daughters as the inheritors of his rule and his land, jointly with the Roman emperor, who by this time, if you're interested, is Nero. So he names Nero the emperor as a joint inheritor with his daughters, hoping, no doubt, that this is going to allow his daughters to retain their position as leaders of their tribe, sort of under the auspices of Rome, while paying lip service to Nero, who's going to stay far, far away. So he's hoping that they can continue to rule in the name of Rome, and in this way retain this precious degree of autonomy that they have. This delicate balance of power is maintained for 12 years after the Iceni Rebellion of 47, until everything changes in the year 60 CE. This balance of power for the Iceni, of being friends with Rome but not being completely overtaken by them, is maintained for 12 years. 12 years since the Iceni Rebellion of 47. So it's during this time that Boudica and Prasutagus have had their daughters, and that Prasutagus has written this will. So by the time everything is about to change, we can imagine that Boudica's daughters are not more than 12 and 10, because she's only been married for 12 years. So in the year 60 CE, Boudicca herself is about 30, and her two daughters are approximately age 10 and 12. And it's in this year that Prasutagus suddenly and unexpectedly dies. When Prasutagus dies, his wife and his daughters are left relying on the delicate balance of alliances and paperwork that he's crafted to attempt to protect them and their position and their land. Unfortunately, the provincial governor of Britain, Gaius Suetonius, has other ideas. Gaius Suetonius decides to take advantage of Prasutagus' death and use the opportunity to seize some of the land and possessions of the Iceni royal family, of Boudicca and her daughters. And Boudicca, of course, protests this. This is not written down in the agreements that they have. These things are lawfully theirs. What is the governor doing, just walking in and helping himself? So she protests. And when she does so, Gaius Suetonius decides to take violent action. He sends his soldiers into Boudicca's family compound like a gang of armed criminals. Boudicca's daughters, who remember are children, about age 10 and 12, are brutally gang raped. And Boudicca herself is stripped and flogged. All of this is done in public. It's a humiliation and a desecration that is brutal, and it's incredibly visible. Gaius Suetonius decides to take violent action. Now let me just pause here and say that if you're listening to this with your children, this is a good moment to press pause and get the kids out of the room. Come back and listen to the last 2 minutes later, because things are about to get really ugly. So because Boudicca has had the temerity to protest, to assert that what he's doing is illegal and wrong, Gaius Suetonius, the governor of Britain, decides to teach her a lesson. So he sends his soldiers into her family compound like a gang of armed criminals. Her two daughters, who remember can't be more than 10 and 12 years old, are brutally gang raped. And Boudicca herself is stripped and flogged. This violation is so brutal, and it's so visible, and it's so horrifying that it would have shocked the entire tribe, and certainly isn't something that Boudicca at all would have thought was in the playbook for the negotiation or the protest that she was having with the governor. So after the soldiers have done these horrifying things to Boudicca and her daughters, they then take whatever else they want. They grab movable objects that are valuable. They take other members of the family. They make them slaves. It's impossible to know how many hours this horrifying ordeal went on. But when the Romans left, the things they had done would have shocked and enraged the entire tribe. After all, If this is what was going to be done to the ruling family of the Iceni, there was no doubt that every man, woman, and child was completely defenseless in the face of what these troops could do to any of them. They were all at the mercy of the legionaries who constantly patrolled their country. This is going to be a pivotal moment for the entire island of Britain. The Romans have now been occupying the country for 17 years. It's begun with tribute and taxes. It's continued with the stealing of land, slave labor, Celts themselves being taken and sold as slaves, used back in Rome for this purpose, an endless barrage of taxes that just seem to keep increasing, the destruction of religious sites, the murder of Druids in an attempt to dismantle the Celtic traditions that they are the keepers of, and now the flogging of a queen and the gang rape of her children. It's the last straw. And it's a moment that's going to start a fire that we're going to see burn across all of Britain. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to come back for the third and final episode in this series, where we find out what Boudicca does that has made her name so famous even to this day. If you're enjoying this series, please like it on your channels, subscribe so you don't miss the next episode, and consider sharing it with someone else that you think would enjoy the stories.